Once you have that in place, you can try out some other shapes. There's a category called SDFs, and these are assigned distance functions. So these are how you define geometry in a raymarching shader. So what they are is a function that takes any given point in space and then figures out how far away the shape is from that point in space. So for like a sphere, it looks at the distance between the center of the sphere and the point that you're looking at, and then looks at the radius of the sphere to see how far away it is along that line. So there's a whole bunch of different SDFs that define different kind of shapes. So we've already used a sphere, so now we're going to try a box frame. Okay, so if we swap that in here, then you can see it's kind of a cube with like bars on the sides and kind of open, or bars on the edges and open sides. So it's got a bunch of different settings that you can play around with, the scale, the thickness of the bars, the position, and so on. So you'll note that in order to hook this up to the renderer, there's only the first input of the renderer is designed to take shape definitions. So the second one is for camera, and then there are other ones for things like lights and some more advanced features. But for now, the first one is the main input. So you wouldn't be able to connect like both a sphere and a box frame to different inputs there. For that, what you need is a combine operator. So there's a category in here called combine. There's a bunch of different options. So we can start with something like a simple union. So this has up to 4 different inputs. So you can connect 2 of those. And you can think of these kind of like a composite top, where it takes in 2 things and then mixes them together in some way to create an output. So then we swap that in here. We can see that simple union is basically just stick both of these shapes into the scene, and wherever they overlap, then it's just an overlap spot. So there isn't any like particular interaction between them aside from just they show up. They both show up. So what this is doing under the scenes is it's looking at those two different inputs, and it says like whichever of those is closer is the distance to that shape combined together. So you don't necessarily need to know like exactly the details of why that works, but that's what it's doing. This is kind of the simplest of the combine operators, but there are a couple others that behave a little bit differently. So if we take a simple diff, so what this one does is, and you can't quite see it here because of the shapes that are in there, but it basically subtracts one shape from the other. So you've got an input here or a setting here where you can kind of like have it swap which of them in here. Let me just move the camera off to the side a little bit so you can see. Yeah. So you can see that like you're either looking at like the sphere minus the box frame, or the box frame minus the sphere. Similarly, there is the simple intersect operator, and this will find all the spots where the 2 shapes overlap and will only output those spots. So this is the shape that of the sphere, like where it is intersecting or overlapping with that box frame. Those are kind of the most basic combine operators. And then we can get into some more advanced ones. So smooth union is a lot like simple union, but it uses a certain amount of radius to kind of blend between the 2 shapes. So you can see when the radius of their mount here is at 0, then it's basically the same thing as simple union. But as you increase it, it blends out those areas where the two shapes overlap. So that way you can kind of get this sort of melting effect where two things kind of blend into each other. And so there is also a, let's see, combined stairs is another way of blending things. So what this does is kind of similar to what smooth union does in that it is combining the two shapes and then doing something at the points where they kind of edges where they overlap. So what it does, instead of just doing a smooth kind of curve, is it does these kind of step shapes. So it's got, and so there are a few different modes this can operate in. So you can either do union, where it's combining the shapes, intersect, where it's kind of the overlap. In this case, it's a little bit hard to see what it's doing there. And then difference, which is kind of that subtraction operation. And like the other diff operator, has an option to kind of swap the two inputs. So we're going to go back to union here. So you see it also has a parameter for number. So this is like the number of steps. And so you can note that like this is, you can either use whole numbers or you can use just kind of any float value and it will smoothly blend those into existence. And in theory, if you crank this high enough, you could get something that was kind of like a flat surface, but generally it's good to stay kind of like within the range because higher numbers, you can kind of induce some like little edge render issues. So it also has a setting for radius, which is kind of the size of the blending area between the two. So you can kind of play with the number and the radius there to change like how big and what the shape is. So there's also an offset parameter, which basically it kind of shifts the stairs in place. So you can do that to kind of get this flowing motion. And this is something that you can kind of increase it continually, and it will kind of smoothly blend. So we're going to create a constant. I'm going to rename this to offset, and then we're going to feed that into a speed chop. And then stick a null, and I'm using the Alt-N shortcut that I learned at the TT Summit, which is amazing. Simplest things make us happy. So we're going to take that and then drag that onto here, onto the offset, and then just do chop reference, or you could do export chop. So for now, it's not doing anything because we have that speed set to 0. But if we increase that, we'll see that it will start moving like that. And because this offset parameter is kind of a continuous value, you can just have it smoothly increase forever, and it will there will never be like a discontinuity or a jump or anything. Here, I'm just gonna hide that. So we have here is a scene that's got a raymarch render at the end. It's got one of these look at cameras. It's got two different shapes, a sphere and a box frame. And then we're combining that with the combined stairs operator. And then we are using a chop with a speed chop to change the value of that offset parameter, and that gives it kind of this flow.